Welcome to the Connected Enterprise Podcast. This is Carl Lewis, your host from Vision33, and my guest today is Ganesh Krishnan, security expert. And that's why we're here today, is to talk about security in today's world. But tell us a little bit about your own personal journey and why security is important to you.
Thank you for having me on the podcast. Great to be here. I have been sort of in the cybersecurity space for the last 25 years or so. I got introduced to cybersecurity at my master's program at Purdue, where I was a research assistant at a cybersecurity lab, and caught on to that from there. This was back in 1996 or so. From there on, I moved on to work in cybersecurity development roles at Intel Labs in Hillsboro, Oregon. And then, Oregon was fairly rainy for me at the time. And so decided to move south to the Silicon Valley, where I was extremely fortunate to work with an elite group of cybersecurity professionals back in the late 90s and early 2000s at a company called Securify, which was started by Taher El-Gamal, well-known person in the cybersecurity industry, behind the El-Gamal signature standard algorithm, which became the digital signature standard. I was very fortunate to work with that team. We were a consulting business back then. Very few people actually knew what cybersecurity really was. I happened to do some work at Yahoo, which was one of the budding and up-and-coming internet companies when internet was just getting started. So joined Yahoo as one of their early security folks. Spent 9 years and change at Yahoo, built the team there, saw the team grow. And then in 2010, left Yahoo to join LinkedIn to help build their cybersecurity practice, fraud detection, abuse detection, identity engineering practice. Spent 5 or 6 years there, and then went to run identity and security at Atlassian. And that's when I realized, hey, I've been doing this for too long. If I do this for way too long, I might go native. So decided to actually switch completely. But I was still passionate about cybersecurity because that's just, happens to be in my DNA. We used to call ourselves paranoids at Yahoo, and that's still a brand. So that's how I think. So I was still passionate about it. So decided to start a cybersecurity company, a startup in the cloud security space in 2017. As we were sort of building the company, we got acquired by Sophos in 2019, which is also a cybersecurity company. Stayed at Sophos for a few years, left last year. When you start a company, when you become an entrepreneur, every problem looks 10x bigger. And so here I am with my next company. So I started my next company called Anzenna late last year, and still in the cybersecurity space, but trying to figure out how to build great products so that we can help the cybersecurity practitioners and the community and cybersecurity in general.
Quite a stretch of years and lots of different experiences along the way. You've certainly seen sort of the security landscape change over those years.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that it's become a bigger problem over the last 3 years. I call it the pandemic effect, if you will. What's changed for security experts through that, those decades that you've been involved? What did they care about when you started, and now what's the big thing?
This is a question I get asked fairly often. Things have changed as much as they've stayed the same, right? So the biggest change that has happened, I see, is that people didn't really know what security was or didn't really think it was that important back then. It was really hard to get people to pay attention and actually get funding for things that we actually wanted to change and get people to make the change, right? I think that has significantly changed with all the breaches and all the press and rightfully so, the attention that the space has got. If you look at sort of the threats, what people worry about, a lot of the higher level threats have fairly stayed the same. I mean, people used to worry about viruses back in 2000s. In the 2000s, now it's shifted to malware because it's no longer checking a blacklist, but things can evolve as they sit on your machine. Or ransomware or spyware. Phishing, I first saw phishing in around 2003. It's amazing. It's been around for 20 years. And still, it's the biggest attack vector that we see. That's getting more and more sophisticated as we move forward. Application security was a big problem back then. It still is. When the internet was starting out, it was fairly easy to hack internet companies because you could change a value in the form and pretend to be something else because people didn't really have the understanding of how to secure things. Now those attacks have gotten more complicated, but the threat is still the same, and it's now being called application security, supply chain, and so on and so forth, right?
Hmm.
The thing that's new is cloud security. Cloud didn't exist, public cloud like AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud 20 years ago. Everything was within four walls. But now people have to figure out how to address the risks that I mentioned when things are not within your four walls. So that has changed. The people threat has remained the same. People have been definitely a huge vector. And over time, and now as we have moved to the cloud and SaaS, the surface area has dramatically expanded. So you see like individual employees at businesses becoming mini IT people because IT itself is decentralized, right? Like I, as an employee of a company, can go sign up for an application like Canva if I feel like, hey, that would help with my marketing designs or whatever I'm trying to do. That was harder to do when you're within four walls. You have to get approvals and contracts and so on and so forth, right? That has changed, and so the people problem gets worse because the attack surface and the complexity has expanded dramatically.
Well, I was just thinking that that kind of brings up my, when you're talking about the attack surface and the cloud, personal devices have, expanded dramatically throughout the period of
Mm-hmm.
your career. And,
Mm-hmm.
now companies have, bring your own device policies and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And it just seems like it's never ending. Even
Mm-hmm.
if they provide laptops, when the pandemic occurred, a lot of my buddies, were telling me, yeah, we provided laptops to everybody in the company. So they all worked remotely. Tremendous expense, but also instantaneously, it just seemed like that threat surface was expanded in a huge way. Um,
Absolutely.
what,
Yeah.
how concerned should organizations be about, what they've done over the last 2 or 3 years, kind of create this mobile workforce and all these other devices? I mean, what is that a big threat?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it at sort of at a high level, sort of, starting at a high level, right? Employees need to be as secure at home as they are at work. That's a huge challenge. So you're not just talking about making sure employees take care of your, sort of when they're at work, they're secure and they handle stuff correctly. But you're actually now you've shifted that and broadened that and said you have to do the same thing at home. Not only that, you have to teach your kids and your spouse and whoever else in your family to make sure whenever you use your laptop for whatever reason, and this happens, we all know that
Mhm.
that they follow certain best practices, and I think so that's why the surface area has tremendously expanded. I'm not sure it's actually avoidable because of what happened. So if all of a sudden people can't go to work, they have to get their work done. So companies have had to scramble to figure out get zero trust infrastructure and things like that in place. But it's not just about technology, as we know, it's about how people handle their day-to-day work. So definitely that threat surface has expanded. BYOD was already prevalent before the pandemic,
Yep.
and that does cross the boundaries. And if you look at it from a not just from a security lens but also from a business lens, that's actually a good thing. It doesn't get talked about much. What gets talked about is, oh, how my company tried to block me from doing X. But the thing is, when employees actually work remotely for companies, it's beneficial for businesses. And that's why businesses have been enabling work
Yeah.
from home, because you're not just working 8 hours, you're working longer, right? And that's
Yeah.
actually implicitly good for companies. So it's about balancing risk. The risks have certainly expanded. There is no easy answers. There are technologies like zero trust and others that have come up that mitigate those risks, but there is no silver bullet here.
In my own company, always working on training staff people to be cautious about email in particular. You mentioned phishing. It seems like it always takes a person sort of not paying attention, right, to
Yeah.
click on an email they shouldn't open, and that causes the problem that spreads at that point. I can understand why IT people are always sort of watching out, and training new staff people. It's interesting you mentioned, kind of training your family. I don't think we've gotten to that level yet,
Mhm.
but it
Yeah.
certainly would be a smart
Yeah.
thing to do. The cloud is new. I don't know what you would put as the start date, but the cloud. But I do think as time has moved on, more and more companies, and even the pandemic caused a lot of companies to move to the cloud
Mhm.
because they weren't really prepared for remote work, and that enabled them
Mhm.
tremendously. From a security perspective, is moving to the cloud a good thing?
Now that we are 10 plus years past that, I think it's a net positive, right? Whenever something new happens, right? Now, all the craze is about chat GPT and AI and what that could do to cybersecurity. And the same thing happened in cloud. Everybody said, oh my God, this is a disaster from a security standpoint. You should never move to the cloud. All your data will be gone, right? That is a legitimate concern when new things come out. But now we are 10 years into this journey. And I think as a security professional, cloud solutions and services are a net positive simply because they're more standardized individually. Like if you're behind four walls, you have to develop your own standards and then kind of seek help, ask a bunch of people. But in cloud, everything is standardized. As long as you understand them and deploy them correctly, your path to security is easier. But of course, understanding and deploying them correctly is where we see challenges today.
Yeah, absolutely. So from your perspective, are call them the cloud providers, AWS, Microsoft, Google, and others as well, they're really kind of the primary provider of that security framework. But the users still maintain it on a routine basis and deploy it right throughout the organization.
That's correct. This question keeps coming up, right? Does moving to the cloud mean that the cloud providers will secure everything? The answer is absolutely not. The only thing you cannot outsource in life is responsibility, right? So you still have to be responsible for, running your business and running your services and securing them and as being answerable to your customers. You can outsource that. Cloud providers do provide is what they call a shared responsibility. So if you use a service, the underlying service has the right security properties as guaranteed by AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, all the major cloud providers. But what they can guarantee is what you run on top of that, right? If you run your own code and your own applications, it's your responsibility to secure it. And in fact, I would go a step further and say you should make sure that even the underlying infrastructure is behaving the way you want. You want to take responsibility for the whole thing, not shirk it.
I sometimes think that some people would put too much trust in the big guys and not really, like you said, pick up that mantle of responsibility. That's a really good way to put it. Well, what about the companies that, for whatever reason, some of them, there are certain, laws and regulations that prohibit some businesses from being in the cloud. And there are others that are just, still, listening to the old tapes that, you're going to lose all your data and that sort of thing. What do they need to be doing, in that four walls, right, to really secure themselves?
Yeah, now it's become the reverse problem. When the cloud started, everybody said, hey, we know better how to secure stuff in the four walls. Now it's kind of shifted to the other side. Like we know
Right.
there's more standardization on the cloud. Now, how do we secure the four walls? Given where things are right now and you want to minimize your data center footprint, right? Unless, some companies have faced massive, like when they become really massive, they can't really use the cloud providers. That's a different problem. But if you are a business that can move to the cloud, small to medium sized business, move as much of your stuff to the cloud as possible and apply the standard methodologies to secure it. And then whatever footprint you have left make sure that it's left for the right business reasons, right? Because, either you can move it due to compliance reasons or, the cost issue or, certain technologies are not supported. That's a fine thing to keep on-prem. And now the challenge is going to be, okay, now you have a firewall, like how do you manage that infrastructure, racking and stacking machines, right? That's getting old. So you're now talking about using 10-year-old technology to secure your data center as the world has moved on to the next thing. Yeah. So I think, and that has been the best practice for the four walls, right? Start with a firewall, deploy your malware agents, manage your own security machines, find the people to do it. It is a challenge.
If a business is finding itself kind of impacted on a routine basis by intrusions, from email or other things, getting into their data, what should they do? What do they start looking at to get improvement in those areas?
It really depends on the size of the business and what the attack surface is. I think the first thing I would say is make sure you take it seriously and invest in cybersecurity. Don't ignore the problem and be proactive about it and understand your risks. These problems happen after the fact, but if you understand the risks and say, hey, there's a lot of sensitive email or there's a lot of email transactions that are happening, then you want to be able to put those controls in place, whether that be spam controls, phishing solutions, employee awareness training, simulations, right? Now, phishing is even shifting to other things like SMS. So you want to be doing those basket of things depending on where you are as a company in terms of risk and your business.
Yeah, one of the things that you just mentioned, SMS, is that everybody uses their own personal phone to text messages. And I've noticed, suspicious stuff showing up. Is there a big risk from a phishing problem occurring on a person's phone that can then transfer itself to the company's network in some fashion?
Absolutely. I mean, I think your phone may end up having a lot of access to company systems or at least company data because if you click on a link and log into your company systems via single sign-on and that was a fake login, or people can send you like fake MFA spoofing. So if your company has multi-factor authentication enabled, the more advanced attacks will trigger a fake approval. So when you give them an approval, they have access to your account and all your data, right? So ultimately, attackers are trying to get access to data, and that can easily be enabled through the phone. Phone is a machine for all practical purposes these days. You can
Yeah,
do everything on the phone. So
more powerful than the first computer I ever had, that's for sure.
that's right.
So
That's right. Yeah.
you mentioned it kind of that businesses can deploy any number of software and hardware solutions. That whole responsibility thing comes down to the personnel, the people, the
Hmm.
employees.
Hmm.
What types of programs do you think companies ought to put in place to sort of educate and re-educate, their employees about the part they play in security?
This is a really good question. And, the what happens today is we have employees take annual training and so on and so forth, right, which we all know are ineffective. I mean, what in effect we are trying to do is tell employees, hey, it's fine to exercise once a year when you're seeing daily threats from a cybersecurity perspective via email, via SMS, or what, all the things we were just talking about, right?
Yeah,
So would you stay fit if you exercise once a year? The answer is absolutely not. So you got to figure out how to exercise more often. That is not just about training. It's actually about a lot more than training. It's about how do you engage employees and make them understand that cybersecurity is not just the problem of a cybersecurity team, but it's the problem of everyone in the company, right? Because the company, for example, if it's allowing you to innovate and use the tools you need to do your job, you have to feel responsible that you're actually responsible for securing the data and the information that comes with that landscape. So it's really important to engage with employees, have systems, processes, and leadership and messaging to make sure that is continuously conveyed to employees on an ongoing basis, right? And it's very different from training is like saying, hey, take the training, and if you check the box and you're on, that works only for compliance. That doesn't work for security, right?
right,
So
right.
that's the situation today. You want to democratize information to employees, right? So there are a few ways to do this is make the right things visible to employees that they need to care about from a cybersecurity standpoint from an ongoing basis, empower them to participate to fix those problems, right? So if I, as an employee, make a mistake, let's say sharing a file, right? I might share a file outside the company with sensitive data. I made a mistake, right? Instead of slapping me on the wrist always, or blocking me always and not telling me how I could do something better, that's a learning opportunity for me that's contextual to me, right? So when I share a file and that gets flagged, I can be notified, say, hey, here is the right way to do this, right? Everybody makes mistakes, but this is the right way to do it. And the more contextual, empathetic we make it, and the more we incentivize and reward employees to participate this way to make the system better, it'll foster engagement, and that will be much, much more effective than a training module or a video or a test.
I agree. Yeah. There's been a lot of talk in the news lately of politicians, and particularly talking about TikTok. Do you think that American companies need to worry about foreign, tools like TikTok, from an intervention perspective?
It's a very good question, right? And I think there is always a worry when a government can just walk into any business and say, oh, I'm going to put my where, or take over your machines, or you have to give me data or whatever, without actually due process. And we are all fortunate to be living in the United States, where that's really hard to do, if not impossible. You have to follow due process, and that's a great thing. Unfortunately, that's not the case with TikTok. We all know that, and that's why these discussions are happening. It's like, hey, if the government that controls TikTok just walks into the TikTok offices and says, hey, give me all the data for all the US users, they have no recourse but to do it. And that's not a good situation. What can we do sitting from here, right? So it's actually, I think, a moral question for businesses who are, for example, advertising on TikTok, to say, hey, is that okay? Like, if I get advertising data, or if I share my advertising metrics or data, or maybe even who my users are with TikTok in some way of for doing business with them, Should I be doing that morally, right? And that's one way to solve it. I think blocking TikTok may or may not solve those problems. I mean, we could block TikTok and make it inaccessible. That's what's being discussed, but it's unclear if that actually solves those problems, right? So
Well,
it's a hard situation, right? So businesses have to think for themselves whether they actually want to advertise on TikTok. That's one way to think about it, right?
yep.
There is no direct threat to a business because it's a consumer service. There is a direct threat to the user using TikTok. So all Americans who have TikTok accounts should really think whether that's important or not. And to some it may be, and to some it may not be. And so, those
Yep.
people can stop using TikTok.
My concern is 150 million users in the United States of
Mhm.
TikTok. That's a lot of personal devices. TikTok is gathering information from. What's to stop the creators of TikTok of creating? I mean, think of the footprint they have with 150 million, devices.
Mhm.
Now, maybe most of them are, 13 to 16-year-olds probably, but even still, if they were to be even more malicious with that kind of a footprint, that seems like a big risk. But the potential is there for that. So I always wonder, not just because this is from China, it's creation,
Mhm. Mhm.
but even any government agency or any bad actor, right?
Mhm.
Being
Mhm.
able to gain that kind of an audience and then utilize that audience for really nefarious purposes. You talked about the surface area, right? That's a big surface
It is.
from which to play. Yeah.
It is. And from that standpoint, there is tangential impact for businesses because, it might be the same mobile device that I'm
Right.
using to check my work email and things like that. So
Yeah.
there is that tangential risk. It's a difficult problem for like what businesses can do. They can basically, prevent their employees from having TikTok if they have like an MDM solution. That's a fine thing to explore depending on the sensitivity of your business, right? They can tell their employees, hey, we are not comfortable with this, and but be transparent with them, right? What businesses don't do well is tell employees the reason they're doing something, right? They will
Right.
install software and say you can't do X, Y, or Z, but tell them why you're doing it. Be transparent with them, then employees will get it. So for businesses that want to do that, they can do that. They can, for businesses that advertise with TikTok, they can put financial pressure on them by just not doing it. That's a moral question for employees, right?
Yeah.
Beyond that, some blocks can be put in place, but you can also overcome blocks through VPNs and another a bunch of other means for people who actually wanted to use the service.
I'm going to pretend that you can see into the future here and ask you, what do you think is kind of on the horizon as it relates to security, and what should we expect to happen over the next 3 to 5 years?
Like I said, the risks are continue to be very similar, right? Like your malware, phishing, AppSec, cloud security, people, even scalability of security organizations, which we haven't talked about because a
Hmm.
lot of companies have the security organizations are very small. And with the expanding attack surface, you need a much better way to scale those organizations. And so there are companies, depending on their maturity scale, are putting people, process, and technology efforts into all of these areas. And I don't think that significantly changes. There isn't a switch we'll be able to flip and say, okay, all of these things have dramatically gotten better, because these are risks that come with being on the internet and doing business. So these have to be continuously mitigated. I don't see, those threats and risks changing dramatically in the next 3 to 5 years. They haven't changed in the last 15, 20 years.
It seems that the better we get at security, the better the bad actors get at breaking it down, right? So it's kind of a constant cycle of improvement, and they're improving their nefarious techniques as well along the way.
That's right. Yeah, it's about security is a process, not a product, right?
Mhm.
That's the way to put it. So it's continuous, a
Yeah.
cat and mouse game, like you said.
It does seem like more people are aware of it now and are putting resources into it,
Mhm.
both in terms of products and people, right? So that probably will become a more important role within companies than it has been in previous years, because people are thinking about it. Once you've been hit by one, then you can't stop thinking about it. Your awareness is increased dramatically. If it's a really malicious event, you can be hurt really bad.
That's correct. That's correct. I mean, it's better to be proactive. Of course, having been in the industry for a while, you can be proactive on everything because you have a limited set of things. You have
Mhm.
resources and that you can prioritize. And then you make continuous improvements, measure your security program where it is, on a periodic basis and see what are the top risks to address year after year after year. And in 5 years, 10 years, whatever the time horizon is, you'll be at a much better place than where you started. That's the way to look
Yeah,
at it.
I think that's a really good piece of advice, especially for small companies.
Mhm.
To prioritize, right? You
Yeah. Yeah.
can't do the whole thing at once, but prioritize, deal with the largest things first that are the biggest
Yeah.
risks. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
and don't look at it just from a compliance lens, right? It's easy to get certified and check a box, but it's hard to get secure.
I like that. The difference between compliance and security.
That's right. That's right.
is significant. Well, Ganesh, thanks so much. This has been helpful and some good information. So we appreciate your being with us today on the podcast. We'll keep watching you because this is a topic that keeps coming up from time to time. So if something new happens out there, we'll come back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Carl, for having me on the show. It was great to be here. Thank you for all the great questions.
And thanks, everyone. We'll see you again on the next episode of the Connected Enterprise Podcast. Stay connected.